very warm welcome to one another lecture there on the Gurukul lecture series. I am Ruchika Singh and I am teaching history in IB College for Women, and my area of specialization is modern Indian history. So as a part of my discipline, it gives me immense pleasure and opportunity to discuss with you one of the most prominent issues of the 19th century, that is de-industrialization. But before we are going to even talk about de-industrialization, it actually makes me boggle about a very famous, you can say, quote that could be used for the beginning of this session, that is by E.H. Carr, in which he wrote about an unending, you can say, discussion or you can say dialogue between present and the past. So we can make it out that the theme need to be seen from that very perspective only. So when we are talking about deindustrialization, it becomes essential for us to understand that it do have a lot of potential and importance in today's contemporary time also, and that's the reason why we are even discussing about it. So we are going to start with a very basic historical background. So the moment I'm even talking about the historical background, it's basically talking about how 18th century witnessed a lot of changes, and these changes somehow paved the path for the, you can say, the beginning of the deindustrialization. So when we talk about the 18th century, we can say that 18th century need to be seen as a period of transition from land-based Mughal Empire to the sea-based British Empire. It was a political economic transition which paved the path for the British Empire, which was an aggressive mercantilist force which turned India into its colony. So in short, we can say that 18th century need to be seen as an era of transition where one can say that there was a dismissal and the demise of the Mughal Empire taking place, and at the same time we can say that it also witnessed a major change that was coming up with the East India Company changing from a company to a political administrative unit. So we can say that this entire, you can say, range of changes that took place in the 18th century makes it even much more important. Now when we are actually talking about that, it need to be seen that this was the era, this was the time period when industrial revolution was also taking place in Europe, which embarked Europe on the path of modernization, and due to which there was consistent demand for raw materials which could only be fulfilled when they are able to procure a place that fulfills their needs. So we can see that Europe was going through the path of the modernization, whereas at the same time India was going through a lot of, you can say, changes that actually made it, you can say, see watershed changes that actually turned her into a colony. Now when we are actually talking about that, it also speaks about how India fits in their demand, and soon it actually made a colony that was not only a great exporter of raw material to Europe, but also a huge market for the finished goods manufactured in the industries of Britain, by causing a destruction to the Indian traditional industries and its market. So in short, we can say that when we are talking about the historical background, we can easily see that deindustrialization need to be seen as a theme that was coming into existence because of all these changes, the major changes that have been otherwise witnessed upon. Now, the moment we are even talking about historical background, it not only familiarizes us with the theme, but it also makes us, motivates us to actually move to a major question that could be elementary beginning to the theme. That is, how are we going to understand the term industrialization? So when we are talking about deindustrialization, the meaning and the variations of the meaning that could be understood as a part of the understanding of the broad spectrum of the term de-industrialization. So when we are trying to answer this question, it actually need to be seen from the perspective that the usage of the prefix de itself to the term industrialization changes its meaning altogether. So the moment we add de to industrialization, it simply says opposite of the term industrialization. And in that sense, we can see that deindustrialization, as it has been otherwise put up by the range of, you can say, scholars and historians, they say that it need to be seen as a state of affairs that endorses decline of indigenous industries in domestic economy and was sustained by British colonial policies. So it clearly shows up that the entire meaning changes up with the usage of the prefix "t". Now, when we are actually talking about the meanings and the variations there in the meaning of the term deindustrialization, it makes us to really go back again there in the 18th century. Again, we are talking about the 1800, when India was a major manufacturer of textiles, which were known for its quality, textile and design. The demand were huge, especially in Europe, Asia and the Middle East. Other industries like leather goods, metalwork and other small-scale industries were also in a great demand. India was a major exporter in many sectors, especially in textile sector, before the British monopoly in India. Now, when we are actually talking about 1800, I mean, this is like what we are otherwise conceiving and remembering about, like India need to be seen as a major manufacturer of textiles. It also gives us a reminiscent, you can say, feeling also, a remembrance also with that even though it could be contested, but still, I mean, we are very much familiarized with it. When we say India had a glorious past, it was India was known as the golden sparrow. Her richness was like something that attracted most of the world around. So we can say that legacy, that heritage was very much visible there in the 18th century also, and even there in the time period of 1800 as well. With that, the establishment of British cotton textile industry caused the major destruction to traditional artisanal production and major decline in the economy and employment of the spinners and the weavers. Hence, Indian manufacturers were not left with any choice rather than to shift to agriculture and other low-paying occupations. This whole process is understood as the deindustrialization of India. Now, when we are actually talking about that, we all know that deindustrialization has been assumed as the, you can say, synonym for the destruction of the traditional artisanal production. And because of the destruction to the artisanal, you can say, production, there was a major decline that was also visible there in the income and the employment of the artisans or the skilled, you can say, weavers that were actually part of this entire, you can say, industry, traditional industry to begin now. So when we are actually looking at the term deindustrialization, this is one conventional way to understand it. But the question that need to be addressed over here is that the term need not to be defined only in one definition that fits in the, you can say, the requirements, or for that matter that is being otherwise conventionally told upon. So when we are actually trying to dig in there in the past and again trying to reassure ourselves that the term need to be modified, need to be elaborated upon, we can say that it actually led to the disappearance of the indigenous codes that patronized handicrafts and regularly employed craftspeople. So the Indian handicraft industry suffered the most as a result of deindustrialization, which led to unemployment and extreme poverty in the country. So when we are actually talking about that, it also talks about how patronage was something that was also getting affected because there was a dismissal of the demise of the Mughal Empire took place. So the entire structure was like being raised from a very different perspective. And that was also the reason the ones who were actually promoting, the ones who were giving some sort of, you can say, assurance that they are going to be put up like in a better position, was something that was disappearing, especially with the you can say with the demise of the Mughal Empire. Now, it also makes us to really wonder that even though there was a dismissal of the demise of the downfall of the Mughal Empire was taking place, and with that there was the emergence of the regional kingdoms as well. So, when we are actually looking at them, the narrative actually speaks a lot about that the changes that have been witnessed to some extent, they were also partly responsible for creating a situation like that. Now, that actually needs to be summed up that there was a huge population that was dependent there on the agriculture. Roughly 63.7% in 1901 was reflected in agrarian sector, which increased to 70% in 1941. That shows that India was turned into an agriculture colony of manufacturing Britain, which required it for obtaining raw materials for its expanding industries. Though there was a time when India was one of the largest exporter of cotton goods all around the globe, and suddenly she was transformed into an importer of British cotton products. So it's pretty clear that the term deindustrialization do have serious implications, and it also speaks a lot about the changes that have changed the entire, you can say, structural pattern of the people who were absolutely dependent on you can say the handicraft industries. So the artisans were affected severely because their entire, you can say, scenario was changed, and they were actually shifting to the agriculture not because out of choice, but something that actually compelled them, pressurized them. So it was not out of choice but out of compulsion that actually made them to be part of the agrarian sector. Now, with that, moving to a more pertinent, or you can say more relatable question that really comes to our mind is that when we discussed about the term deindustrialization, it won't be a more wiser approach if we are not going to talk about how it actually affected, or in a way, I mean, the implications or the impact of the deindustrialization are not going to be talked about. So now what we are going to do is we are going to talk about the impact of the deindustrialization, but before we are going to even talk about, it would be more, you can say, appropriate to start with the discussion that after the implementation of Charter Act of 1813, which allowed one-way free trade to British citizens, the cheap machine-made imports from Britain flooded the Indian markets. The newly established railway network supported European products to reach the most remote parts of the country. India transformed from net exporter to net importer. So, we can see that with the implementation of the Charter Act of 1813, the entire scenario changed. I mean, there was a time when there was an influx of bullion taking place in India, and it was pretty, you can say, conducive and comfortable and profitable there in the case of India. That was absolutely changed with the coming of with the implementation of the fostering of the Charter Act of 1813. So now Britishers too have, I mean, their fair, you can say, as per their perspective, chances to really excel by. And the Charter Act of 1813 gave them the opportunity that they can actually engage themselves there in the free trade. And the tariffs were also being imposed there on the Indians. So the entire, you can say, world was turned upside down, especially there in the context of India, because now she was flooded with the cheap machine made imports that were coming from Britain, and the railway network system that was apprised and, you can say, established by the Britishers somehow supported that the products are reaching they're in the remotest part of the country. So it changed the entire scenario. There was a time she was the net exporter, and now she is like being recalled and remembered as the net importer. Now that really talks about that, with the coming of the Charter Act of 1813, high taxes were imposed there on the Indian goods to discourage people from buying them. Tariffs of nearly 80% were imposed on Indian textiles, making Indian cloth no longer affordable. So it shows up that when we are actually talking about, you can say, the policies and the structures that were apprised by the Britishers somehow sanctioned them, that they do have the maximum benefit of the situation. And with the coming of the high tariffs, the Indian textiles and the people who were involved there in the Indian textiles suffered the most. So it was no longer something that everybody can afford buy, something that one can easily get hold of. The other impact of deindustrialization could be seen there in the context that many well-developed cities as well as India's ruralization process occurred. Many artisans abandoned their professions and moved to villages, and they got indulged in agriculture as a result of the diminishing returns and the repressive policies of the Britishers. During British rule, the major source of poverty and the reason behind the destruction of the village economic structure was the overburdened agricultural sector. So we can see very well that with the coming of this process, the cities, the areas that were very much, you can say, involved in these skilled activities, who were known as the major, you can say, skill centers, they saw a major decline, and it also led to the ruralization of the process as well. So many of the artisans were forced, they were compelled to look for the other, you can say, options, and the option that they thought about, the only option that they actually got, it would be better to say that way, they got themselves indulged there in the agriculture. And the result was not something that was promising, but it was pretty diminishing, and the repressive and the oppressive policies of the Britishers even made the situation even more tense. Now, because of that, there was a major, you can say, poverty that was witnessed around, and it also led to a major destruction there in the village economic structure. So there was you can say, overburdening that was happening there in the agriculture sector, and with that there was a major shift also need to be held responsible for that. So the artisans who were forced and compelled to indulge in agriculture actually made the agrarian sector overburdened. So now moving to the other part that really talks about that Britishers came up with the revenue generating policies that forced the production of the market and broke up these communities. Production for the market was not profitable, that led to widespread rural indebtedness. Many peasants lost their land and turned into tenants or laborers. So, on the other hand, the moneyed people who came to control or own their land were by nature averse to productive investment. The net result was stagnation along with the increasing poverty and inequality. So we can see clearly that the range of observations that have been put by the set of historians clearly showcase that the policies were majorly responsible for creating a scenario like that. It was also expected that the people who are the moneyed people, they also tried to, they were not actually putting much of the efforts to improve their condition. Now we are going to talk about the major, you can say, causes or the factors or the reasons that actually made this process to happen up. So the primary source of demand for these handicraft products were the royal courts and urban aristocrats. But with the abolition of the royal courts, eliminated one source of demand of these craft products, and the craftsmen gradually closed their karkhanas. So when we are actually talking about that, it also reminds me of the work of D.R. Gadgil, the industrial evolution of India in recent times, that because of the dismissal of these royal courts, indigenous courts and urban aristocrats, the motivation that was actually giving them some sort of, you can say, safety, or for that matter that they are going to be rewarded for their work, was something that was missing. When we are actually talking about that, the other aspect that need to be talked up over here is the technological revolution that actually accelerated throughout the 19th century, and in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, it ultimately led to the decline of the traditional handicrafts. Cheap and machine-made imports were flooding the Indian market after the Charter Act of 1813, allowing one-way free trade for the British citizens. So we can see that with the coming of the technological revolution, the entire scenario changed, because now a major, you can say, change that was visible was that now cheap and machine-made imports were flooding the market. And whereas when it was like happening, Indian products found it very difficult to penetrate the European markets. High taxes were imposed on Indian products, and in the competition with the goods that are made with the machine had been able to conquer the market of the colonized India. So we can see that high taxes, then the policies played a very important role in, you can say, making the situations very tense for the artisans. Now, it was during this period the control and impact of the British expanded there in the eastern part of the globe, and their possession of the Indian sub-mainland extended fundamentally. So we can see that the control and the impact was seen almost everywhere. So their expansion there in the eastern part definitely put Indian sub-mainland in their kitty. If we are going to go further, we can see that the British cotton confronted, you can say, inconsistent rivalry from the Indian cotton industry of these states. The cost of the British cotton industry were decreased altogether to encourage strength of British cotton. Thank you.